consistently upheld as canon. It's rather basic. A black background with a Polybius logo, copyright information and credits, and nothing else. However, compared to contemporary games from 1981, one thing stands out. The logo is unusually large and detailed. Back then, fancy graphics were confined to the printed marquees. Every kilobyte of the ROM was valuable, so most game titles were rendered in the standard font, or at a much smaller scale. This did change over the next few years, and by 1983, larger, more lavishly designed title screens were more common. The closest match in terms of style might be from Nintendo. Their games favour large, bold titles with similar lettering. Perhaps Polybius drew inspiration from Versus Pinball or Duck Hunt. Of course, both of these date to 1984, which makes Polybius's 1981 claimed year of release look spurious. Perhaps it was just ahead of its time. Another detail from this screenshot is the font used for the smaller text. Those with a keen eye might recognise a similarity to those used by Williams games, such as Defender or Robotron. And it's definitely a close match, but they're not identical. The smallest 5-pixel high text does match Robotron, but the larger 7-pixel text does not. There is one game that comes closer. Nearly a perfect match. And while still a Williams title, it's the much less well-known Bubbles. It's still not a pixel-perfect fit, but it is closer than any other. The minor differences could be attributed to font hinting, JPEG artifaction, or perhaps a deliberate alteration. In any case, the text is distinctly Williams. Either Polybius is some lost prototype, or the image was fabricated by someone who drew influence from their games. The screenshot has been around for almost as long as the myth, and is likely the original source for the turquoise bubble-lettered logo. It doesn't exactly give us much to go on, and it certainly doesn't reveal what the gameplay might have been like. There are some that claim to reveal more of Polybius, such as these vector-esque images distributed on the now-defunct polybiuslives.com. First emerging around April in 2008, there's little supporting evidence for their veracity. All signs point to a fan-made creation. Besides, it doesn't make sense. If you had the ROMs and were able to take screenshots of a functioning game, why not show it in motion? To see the game running would be a revelation. There have been multiple people who claim to hold the Polybius ROMs, and yet there's no sign of them anywhere. However, there is no shortage of gameplay footage out there, but these are all fan-made interpretations, impressions of what Polybius may have been like. One of the first emerged around April 2004, distributed by a site called gooddealgames.com. The original source unknown. With a spooky icon, it's clearly supposed to evoke the myth, and those who are brave enough to run it are given a warning. The Polybius video game has been linked to impaired memory and psychological changes. Gameplay may cause epileptic seizures in susceptible individuals. Do you still want to continue? Click OK, and you'll be met with the familiar title screen, reformatted for a 4:3 monitor, with the logo rapidly flashing while a sound effect plays, a sequence of rising tones. The flashing continues until you press a key. And then, nothing. The game exits with a fatal error, and a message box that reads, "April Fools, send this urban legend to a friend." Interestingly enough, if you take the executable into a hex editor, you'll find the 2 MB file is not quite what it seems. The first 10 kilobytes consist of some data, but the rest? Empty space, acres of zeros, terminated with a few bytes of text. April Fools. so we can write that one off as an obvious joke. But there is another game that has become the dominant example when searching for Polybius gameplay. It came from a site at Zinnislotion.com, the supposed developers of the original. But the site explains that it's just a fan-made attempt to recreate what might have been. Launch the executable and you're presented with the obligatory warning screens. Do not play this game, etc. And ominous mentions of cognitive interfaces and higher functions. A familiar logo appears, but this is no mere prank. There's an actual game amidst all the spooky theatrics. The gameplay is admittedly simple, giving you control of a ship that can move in, out, or rotate the playfield. Like the original legend insists, there's more to the game than simple shooting. Glowing shapes bearing numbers appear, and if these numbers match either digit appearing on the base, or are evenly divisible, then you'll reduce the base's number by that amount. Once the base reaches 0, you advance on to the next level, where the visuals get progressively trippier. Aside from the puzzle element, the gameplay resembles vector games like Tempest or Star Castle, although some aspects are inconsistent with vector graphics, such as the swirling backgrounds. Entering the code 35, 34, 31, 54, 12, 24, 45, 43, the code that corresponds to Polybius on a Polybius square, grants access to the higher game functions. There's a host of extra settings here, some relating to auditory entrainment, subliminals, and color strobe, which disable some elements of the game. Others are more fanciful, however. REM imprinting, gameplay amnesia, operant paradigm triggers. Countless settings designed to inspire the right level of paranoia. Cracking open the executable's resources reveals the game was made in Dark Basic, a game creation tool. Using a more specialized tool called Dark Explorer, we can reveal all of the game's assets, graphics, sound effects, etc. All of the subliminal aspects are laid bare. A variety of messages written in dark grey flashed briefly during gameplay. Obey, consume, submit. It's like something straight out of They Live. The sound effects are similar. Most are synthetic tones, but some feature voice recordings and sounds of breathing. Presumably, these are played at a barely audible level.
Why don't you play? Try the game, try the game, try the game.
Altogether, a pretty neat package for those who want to build their own Polybius cabinet. But who's behind it? The credits hidden in the Higher Functions menu give us some insight. Igor Uspeni's PhD, and a mysterious number sequence. 4, 8, 15, 16, 23, 42. The numbers should be familiar if you've ever watched Lost. And it turns out the name is equally cryptic. It's an anagram of Rogue Synapse. The Whois data for Zinnislotion.com lists an email from the domain gorkaweb.com, which in turn links to roguesynapse.com. It's the site of an arcade enthusiast with a particular passion for recreating fictional arcade games, such as Space Paranoids seen in Tron, or the eponymous cabinet from The Last Starfighter. It's a fantastic fan-made project, but as far as the Polybius myth is concerned, it's just a tribute. With the explosion of indie developers over the last decade, there have been quite a few other interpretations made, both for desktop and mobile. There was even a version made for the Atari 2600, with very limited distribution at the Retro Gaming Expo 2013. Few of these later examples make any claims of authenticity, and they generally follow a simple shoot-'em-up formula. One particularly recent game that bears the Polybius name is Jeff Minter's version for PSVR. Minter is a veteran game dev long noted for his unusual games and light synths. Since 1981, he's been responsible for a steady stream of psychedelic experiences. Polybius stays true to the Minter mold, and with the rapidly strobing colours and breakneck pace of gameplay, you can see why the game has pretty strong warnings before you start. Its pulsating visuals and trance soundtrack mesh together to keep you in the zone. But its intentions are benevolent, with subliminal messages reminding players of the virtues of a nice cup of tea. It's good, but it's Polybius in name only. An homage to a legend.
I certainly think there's some truth to Polybius. Lots of random arcades have been used as test beds for legendary unreleased arcade games, such as Marble Madness 2 and Primal Rage 2. And several other unreleased games have also been spotted in the background of old news reports, so Polybius could have easily been one of those. What I don't buy is the whole governmental conspiracy behind it. I mean, why would the FBI want to test a machine that makes people nauseous, not only in public, but also on children? I mean, what possible benefit could they have from giving kids migraines? If they really wanted to make kids feel sick, all they needed to do was wait 10 years for Nintendo to invent the Virtual Boy.
So despite all the promises and these fan-made interpretations, nothing resembling a Polybius ROM has ever surfaced. A few fan-made versions and some screenshots of dubious origin are all that exist in the digital domain. But arcade machines are physical things. So what about any physical evidence? Of course, the original story tells of the machine's sudden disappearance. But what if one unit was forgotten? What if they weren't destroyed, but sequestered in some warehouse? What if someone found one? Well, there are some who claim they have. The videos all follow a familiar pattern. A shaky camera led by rumours of Arcade Hall, to the reveal, a dark cabinet bearing a familiar name. Some even feature gameplay. Normally it's just the Rogue Synapse version, but sometimes it's something original. And then, just as things are getting interesting, what was that? Jump scare. Roll credits. Invariably, it's arcade enthusiasts showing off their custom cabinet work and having a bit of fun in the process. And who can blame them? Polybius is an essential part of arcade myth, and to have your own machine is quite the talking point. Only one Polybius cabinet is unaccounted for. A low-resolution black and white photo that appears on the Killer List of Video Games entry for Polybius. It's a Namco-style cabinet dating from about 1979 to 1981. You can see the same style in Galaxian, Galaga, or Pac-Man examples. The black panels and T-molding most strongly suggest a Galaga cabinet with the decals removed. But the sides appear to be lighter, perhaps white, which means it could be the rarer Bosconian or a converted Bosconian cabinet. The controls don't match, however, just a single button and stick. And the coin box isn't consistent with Namco machines of that era. It is period correct, definitely from the early 80s, but the dual steel plate style is more likely to be from a Data East or Nichibutsu machine. So it could be a custom build, repainted and assembled from spares, or even built from scratch. There's also the very real possibility that it's simply a Photoshop. The Polybius marquee could have been applied directly from the screenshot. The low resolution and lack of colour make detecting a fake difficult, and I suspect it's deliberate. An original photo of a custom cabinet, perhaps, but it seems altered to fit the myth. It's not just cabinets. Sometimes someone will claim to have a circuit board from the fabled game, such as the one featured here. If it were real, it might even be playable with the right connections, or the ROMs could be dumped and subsequently emulated. It would be a very valuable find, if it were real. This is definitely an arcade PCB, but it's not Polybius. it's a bootleg Ms. Pac-Man with some minor photoshopping to obfuscate its origin. It's not even enough to fool Google's reverse image search, so we can confidently ignore this particular claim. Manufacturing an arcade game is something which involves a lot of people. Engineers, programmers, artists. It's not a task undertaken solo. So, with multiple people involved, surely by now, someone would have come forward with information. Well, as it happens, there have been a few. Although whether they tell convincing stories is another matter. One testimony comes from an anonymous source who claims Polybius was associated with Sega's arcade division. He's known only as PRG-017.
I know I will not be believed, but still, I believe this must be told. I have information on a video game called Polybius. This game is real. I was a programmer in Sega's arcade division.
They play the myth straight, insisting that their secret project was designed to stimulate specific parts of the human brain, with testers suffering amnesia and loss of arcade game fandom. They then go on to explain that the Sega Genesis CD made use of Polybius code fragments in order to get the two processors syncing up. The account is poorly written and loose on real detail. It leans rather too heavily on the original myth, and the introduction of a link to Sega doesn't seem to make much sense. The technical details are vague, and the timeline doesn't quite match up. The Sega CD wasn't released until 1991, a decade after Polybius. Given the overly dramatic ending, unverified status, and complete lack of supporting evidence, PRG-017 is a fraud. Perhaps the most prominent claimant of responsibility is a man named Stephen Roach, who, in a series of posts in early 2006, claimed to be one of the original programmers of Polybius.
I think it's about time I lay this to rest. My name is Stephen Roach. Cine Solution was a company set up by myself and several other amateur programmers in 1978.
He says he's primarily based in the Czech Republic, where he set up a company called Cine Solution with several mainly amateur programmers that worked on component parts for PCBs, with programming as a limited but very profitable sideline. Interesting how a band of several programmers saw programming as a sideline, but anyway, he goes on to detail the beginning of Polybius.
We were approached around 1980 by a Southern American company that shall remain nameless for legal purposes, to develop an arcade game that centered around a new approach to video game graphics.
So, a Czech company that specialized in PCBs was approached by an unnamed Southern American company to develop an arcade game which would be tested in a limited North American market. Truly a global conspiracy. He goes on to explain how the side effects started happening early in playtesting, and how the resultant cover-up might have inspired the stories of Men in Black. I'll be honest, the writing smacks of impostorship. It's all recounted in run-on sentences dressed in dramatic language that wouldn't be out of place in a poorly written ghost story, and several things just don't add up. He claims to have been born in Rhyl in Wales and moved to Czechoslovakia in 1965 at the age of 15 due to his parents' business interests. An interesting proposition, given the fact that the country was under communist control at the time. He claims the Polybius name was chosen by one of his colleagues who studied Greek mythology, but Polybius is a historical figure, not a mythological one. The majority of his ramblings are just expansions of the original myth, and what little novel detail exists is presented without proof. I reached out to him via his email address, but received no reply. He did reply to an interview call from BitParade Co.UK, however, where he answered some questions about his role in making the game. Disappointingly, much of it is copied verbatim from his original post, Perhaps he wanted to keep his story straight, or didn't want to expend too much creative effort in developing the story. He does go into more detail about the gameplay, however, describing the puzzle elements that would later influence Rogue Synapse's interpretation of the game. In Kat Despera's 2012 article, Reinvestigating Polybius, she found a possible link between Stephen Roach and the Czech Republic. Someone with that name was running a troubled teen facility in Brno. However, this Stephen Roach was originally a policeman from Utah, whereas the one associated with Polybius claims to have been born in Wales, so perhaps it's just a coincident name. Everything about Stephen Roach reeked of a hoax. I had one lead left to follow. The original claims were made on a few different sites, but Roach was most active on the Retro Gamer forums, where there are a number of follower posts. The thread goes on for several pages. A few suspiciously new accounts are quite active. It seems someone might have been using sock puppets to fuel discussion. Later, a moderator confirms that several names are posting from the same IP, and Stephen Roach is amongst them. Most of these accounts were created specifically for the ruse, but the oldest had been used in good faith. I checked the post history, an introduction. I had the prankster's full name and an approximate location. A quick Google search turned up social media accounts that matched. I sent him a tweet and waited. I originally said that I received no reply from Stephen Roach via email, and this was true at the time of writing, and up until a few days after I sent this tweet. As if by magic, 2.5 months after sending the original email, he finally gets back to me. I was approaching the end of this project. I didn't have time for his games. I had to call his bluff. So I addressed him by his real name. I said, perhaps it's time to retire the Stephen Roach persona. It was a long shot, and it didn't work. He kept up the pretense. Even in the face of the evidence I had, he wasn't going to give it up. Shortly after, I received a reply on Twitter from my suspect. My original inquiry was polite, pretty straightforward, but the response was obtuse, hostile even. I wasn't going to get a confession, but by now I was fairly sure I'd found the guy responsible. Let there be no doubt, Stephen Roach is a red herring, and his story entirely fabricated.
Most of what we know about Polybius comes second hand, and this lack of primary evidence makes me suspicious of the whole thing. However, what we do have is primary evidence for real events that are a bit like some of the things that happened in the Polybius legend. And it's quite easy to see how this could have been embellished or misunderstood to create the Polybius story in these second-hand accounts as they're retold. History isn't necessarily what happened, it's what people say happened.
So, there's a lot of evidence wrapped within the Polybius myth, but not much of it is convincing. The same stories crop up time and time again, sometimes with embellishment, sometimes with new theories, but never anything that links the game to its supposed origin in the arcades. Making sense of it all and establishing the truth is a difficult task, and I'm not the first to try. Perhaps the best way to establish Polybius' origin is to start in the present. Rather than chasing unverifiable rumours from nearly 40 years ago, instead, we can trace the evidence that exists today back to its source. This trail might not lead all the way back to 1981, but wherever it ends might provide insight as to how this story began. As a starting point, we can look to Wikipedia. Its article history is transparent, and the site has been around for a while. On February the 25th, 2005, the Polybius video game page was created. But this isn't the first mention of the game on Wikipedia. Going back to November the 30th, 2004, the main Polybius article, the one about the historian, was amended with a section titled The Arcade Game/Hoax. Going back further, there was a short-lived edit on the 29th of February the same year that read, Polybius is also the name of a possibly fictitious video game in contemporary folklore. Related to Atari's Tempest, it legendarily led to mental illness in players. This is the earliest mention I could find. But what exactly prompted its Wikipedia inclusion early in 2004? The internet was young and going viral, an as yet unknown concept. But in August, Polybius was featured in Slashdot, which was a pretty big deal back in 2003, and it mentions an inclusion in a recent issue of GamePro. At the time, GamePro was the world's largest independent multi-platform gaming magazine, and claimed to be read by over 3 million gamers a month. In issue 180, cover date September 2003, although published some weeks earlier, there was an article called Secrets and Lies. The article featured 6 gaming myths, with each assigned a verdict: true, false, or inconclusive. Polybius was number 6. The article expressed doubts over the game's veracity, citing a lack of evidence and the relative ease of fabrication, but it ultimately awards an inconclusive. It was this GamePro article that played an important role in propagating the Polybius myth, exposing the game to a widespread audience that might not have had access to the internet. It's not the origin of the story, but a key catalyst that transformed the game from obscure rumor to a widespread legend.
Yeah, I think GamePro was probably a primary source for gamers to find out about Polybius. I think that writing about it in a national magazine certainly brought it to attention. And then, of course, after it appeared in GamePro, a lot of people then spread the legend and told their friends or asked other people, have you known anything about it? And probably added a lot of their own details along the way, because that's how urban legends work, right?
Polybius's activity pre-GamePro was much more subdued, but even in early 2003, the game was still well known to arcade enthusiasts. It turned up on Snopes' forums in July, and had mention in a hoax roundup sometime shortly afterwards, asserting that this one is just a gag someone invented several years ago, which has now become enshrined on the web. Sometime shortly before February the 15th, 2003, an article on Polybius appeared on gooddealgames.com. A familiar screenshot appears, and at some point there was also a link on the site to the April Fool's version of the Polybius executable. Most interestingly, at the bottom of the article there is a small banner with special thanks to a site called coinop.org. Coinop.org is a resource for collectors and enthusiasts of arcade games. It features a fairly comprehensive database of games, along with a knowledge base populated with repair and maintenance documents. The site is a common factor in many of these early articles. It seems they've had a page on Polybius longer than anybody else. Their description of the game is quite familiar. It seems most later articles have been based on this one. The screenshot appears here too. At the bottom of the page is a creation date, the 3rd of August 1998, our earliest yet. But is it verifiable? The URI for this page has changed several times over its lifetime, so tracking down the first date of appearance is tricky. But with enough digging and copious use of the Wayback Machine, we can attempt to discern an origin. The current page's history only goes back to February 2014. At this point, URI rewriting rules made things more human-readable. The page prior can be tracked all the way back to 2003. Before this, the site used lengthy GUIDs, with a minor change in 2002. This URI is the oldest I could find on the coinop.org domain, which takes us all the way back to June the 21st, 2000. The entire site moved domain around this time. While it originally started on coinop.org, at some point during 1999, it was incorporated into click2.com. first as a subdomain, then later as a subdirectory. It's here where we can track the Polybius page as far back as possible. A capture exists from March the 3rd, 2000. Interestingly, the creation date of 1998 is missing, as is the screenshot. However, there is a last modified date instead, given as the 6th of February 2000, along with a note. New edition, anyone heard of this game? This seems to imply that the 6th of February is the date the page was added. I mean, it says new edition. So why does the page today insist that it was created in 1998? When did the date created field first appear? A capture from April 29th, 2003 lacks the page created date. The next capture has it. This means it was added between these two dates. The date might have been recorded before this but not displayed. But another possibility is that the date created field was made later on and populated with a default value. I suspect the latter case is true, principally because almost all the other game pages share the same creation date, down to the 4 AM time. It is possible that Polybius was present in the database back then, but there's absolutely no evidence for it. What we do have is a verified capture from early 2000 with a date of February the 6th and a claim of a new edition. I had nothing earlier in my timeline. This could be our origin point. Day 0, the day the myth started. So how can we prove that this was the starting point? Or, more accurately, how can we disprove it? We're nowhere close to the supposed release date of 1981. So is it possible to find any earlier evidence? Anything at all? A throwaway mention, a forum post, or magazine article? Now, rumour has it that the myth first emerged on Usenet, circa 1994. It's not as popular today, but Usenet was once the go-to place for news, discussion, and rumour. It's also fairly well preserved. Since 1995, Deja News has archived Usenet. And in 2001, they were acquired by Google. Today, Google Groups is the largest archive of Usenet posts, with the full Deja archive searchable, along with supplementary data that goes all the way back to 1981. Its search is imperfect, but with some patience, we might get some results. A broad search for Polybius pre-2000 turns up some predictable results. It is the name of a Greek historian, after all. It is matters of history that most often come up, with the occasional reference to a Polybius cipher in cryptological talk. There's also a user named Polybius, who was quite active in Alt Mag Playboy between 1997 and 1998. Narrowing the search domain to known groups helps improve results. And one in particular is a nexus for arcade collectors. Rec Games Video Arcade Collecting, RGVAC for short. These guys are invested in arcade rarities, because if something's rare, it's valuable. So Polybius would be right up their alley. One of the first instances of the word was posted in April 2000, just a couple of months after the game first appeared on coinop.org. Posted by a user named NYMechanicalBR08, it links to coinop.org, a reply to a request for information on an obscure German video game, which triggered an association. The OP of this particular thread is a German fellow named Christian Windler, also known as Cyber Yogi, but we'll get to him later. On the 27th of February 2000, just 3 weeks after it was first posted to coinop.org, a user named Zoob posted a link on Polybius' page on click2.com. No, not the Greek historian. An arcade game, he says. I am skeptical of the claims made on the following page, but they certainly make for interesting reading. I actually spoke to Zoob. I wondered how he had found Polybius. He told me. I simply wandered across it in one of my random walks on the net. It was serendipity, nothing more. Google Groups' search is far from perfect, so it is possible we've missed something. So what about other Usenet archives? A manual grep of the U2 Zoo Net News archive from archive.org, some 5 gigabytes of text when uncompressed, yields just 3 results, all of which refer to the historian. A discussion of the evidence for the historical Jesus from Net Religion Christian in 1985, and a passing mention in Net Politics the same year. I even tried a paid search of the Usenet archive, a site that claims to be broader and more easily searchable than Google's inherited dataset. I found 0 results pre-2000. If there's nothing within the Usenet archives, perhaps another domain entirely will prove fruitful. Perhaps there is a mention of Polybius in print. Google Books describes itself as the world's most comprehensive index of full-text books, and it is freely searchable. Searching for Polybius between the years 1980 and 2000 yields several pages of results, but every single last one of them refers to the historian. Google Newspapers is a similar story. Perhaps a more specific search is needed, within the enthusiast press perhaps. In the 1980s and 90s, video games were better served by magazines than any other media. I searched nearly 200 gigabytes of gaming magazines, over 3,000 issues worth, for any instance of the word Polybius. There were 3 results. One from the September 1998 issue of Acorn User, a review of Ancient Greeks, a multimedia CD-ROM. Another pair from 2 adjacent issues of Commodore User, January and February 1986. Programming listings for codes and ciphers on your Commodore Micro, and an implementation of the Polybius square. That's it. The only instances of the word Polybius across 20 years of the gaming press. If the Polybius myth existed prior to the year 2000, it wasn't widespread. To my knowledge, no 20th century evidence exists. It's impossible to say for certain, but with no trace of prior evidence, we can only presume coinop.org is where the story began. And whoever posted it there might be responsible for everything. One name I've seen frequently implicated in the Polybius myth is a German fellow named Christian Oliver Bindler, also known as Cyber Yogi, Teachmaster of Logology, the first Cyber Age religion. The denizens of RG-VAC were quick to pin the blame for Polybius on him. He had a bit of a reputation, it seems. It does all seem to fit. He was in the right place at the right time, and his interests align. There's also the German connection with Zines Lotion. However, I believe Cyber Yogi is innocent.
Stop harassing me with this damn myth. I didn't make Polybius. Otherwise, the man in black would now go after me. I have absolutely nothing to do with it.
True. He did pull an April Fool's Day prank in 2000. He fabricated a supposedly lost East German variant of Phoenix. True. He was interested in obscure arcade games, particularly trance-inducing Zoner games. And true, he is a little eccentric. But why would a native German speaker use a mangled word? And if he didn't want to be caught, why use German at all? Why would he conduct 2 rather ornate pranks in the same year? And why would he come clean about one, but not the other? Critically, how did he get an entry for the game on coinop.org? The coinop.org domain has been around since 1993, although the earliest page capture dates back to late 1996, approaching the limit of the Wayback Machine. Back then, the domain was home to the Virtual Coin-Op Museum, run by Stephen W. Reiner. It was a collection of photographs and articles relating to arcade machines. However, in 1998, Stephen offered the coinop.org domain to the users of the RGVAC newsgroup. He didn't have the time to maintain it, and so sought someone who could make better use of it. He ended up giving the domain to a web developer named Kurt Koller. By August 1998, Kurt had taken ownership of the domain and had relaunched the site as a games database. In April 1999, he moved the site to a subdomain of click2.com. And, interestingly, he mentions the addition of a German language version. In early 2000, we see another flurry of activity. The CoinOp site moves from a subdomain of click2.com to a subdirectory instead. It's around this time that the first evidence of Polybius emerges. By August 2000, the CoinOp site moved back to its own domain, where it's lived ever since. So, who provided the information for the site? The bulk of the games database is sourced from community-maintained lists of games, some of which are still present in coinop.org's knowledge base, and data contributed from other sites and projects, the MAME arcade emulator, for instance. Coinop.org has always had an open call for contributions, but the presented entries for games are manually curated and incorporated into the database, presumably by Kurt. He had exact control over what appeared on the site, and he's always had that control. So perhaps he received a tip about Polybius. Perhaps someone emailed him the description and he reproduced it in good faith. Maybe, but if his intent was to maintain an accurate list of games, why would he keep the text unaltered if most of his arcade collecting peers were quickly prepared to write it off as a hoax? Why would he update the entry in 2009, promising more information? Stay tuned. Information which has yet to transpire. Finally, remember the GamePro article? The one that exposed Polybius to a mainstream gaming audience and is perhaps the single largest factor in the legend's persistence today? I spoke to the author of that article, Dan Amrich, and asked him where he first found out about Polybius.
Kurt was the person who first tipped me off about Polybius. I've thought about it for a long time, and ultimately I came to the conclusion some years ago that Kurt was probably just making all of this up and pulling the wool over my eyes, and he sent it in as a tip to see if I would bite, and obviously I bit.
Everything pointed towards Kurt. He was behind coinop.org, and thus responsible for the earliest confirmed emergence of the myth. As an arcade enthusiast, he would have been familiar with the games from Polybius' era. In fact, he owned some of them. As a web developer, he would have had the necessary skills to forge a convincing-looking screenshot. He also had at least some familiarity with the German language, but he wasn't fluent, hence Sinnes Lotion. He's no stranger to internet fame either. He's the one behind the Taco Bell $2 bill refusal story, under the Usenet pseudonym Captain Sarcastic. Finally, he had a motive. He wanted to drive traffic to coinop.org. And when he sent a tip-off to GamePro magazine, it paid off and immortalized the legend. In any case, to uncover the truth, I was going to have to speak to him. So I emailed him, asked if he'd answer a few questions. He said, sure. I asked him directly, were you responsible for the game's addition to the site? If not, who was the source? Where did the screenshot come from? His answers weren't helpful. He insisted the game was present on the site since day one, the 3rd of August 1998, despite the contradicting evidence. He went on, the entry's wording on coinop.org is very specific. That's all I'm allowed to comment on. I didn't expect a confession, but it was clear he wasn't going to let me ruin his fun without some resistance. By this point, I was almost certain he was behind the Polybius myth. He was, at the very least, complicit. So he was definitely hiding something. But what did he mean by very specific wording? My mind was cast back to the connection between Polybius and cryptology. The Polybius square. Could the very specific wording of the Polybius entry be hiding something? A coded message? At this point, I'm not even sure. It could just be me reading between the lines, a wild goose chase. But I suppose it's worth a try. Rereading the text, I noticed some unusual things. The writing is odd, with rather too many commas, and some peculiar wording choices. There's also a spelling mistake, disappeared with a missing E, which is not necessarily unusual, but it has gone untouched for 17 years. Maybe he never noticed it, but he did notice a spelling mistake on the Polybius Wikipedia article. There's an edit by a Kurt S. Koller made on the 27th of October 2005, where he corrects the spelling of non-existent. So maybe the spelling is intentional. But what does that mean? Perhaps word length is a factor. Perhaps his code needed a 10-letter word and nothing else would fit. Despite my suspicions, my attempts to decipher a message that may or may not exist were fruitless. Besides, code breaking was outside the scope of my intention. We already had an origin, and we had a likely suspect. Maybe I was hoping for something more. During my search for Polybius' origin, I had seen numerous claims that the myth first emerged on Usenet in 1994, but I never saw any direct evidence for this. However, there is one thing which definitely emerged on Usenet in 1994, a puzzle that has a startlingly similar name. It's called the Publius Enigma. Anonymous claims of a hidden meaning within Pink Floyd's The Division Bell album. On Alt Music Pink Floyd, an anonymous source emerged with cryptic clues. Few believed it at first, but when the words Enigma Publius appeared in lights at a Pink Floyd concert, well, clearly there was something to it. However, to this day, the Publius Enigma remains unsolved. No hidden message was ever found. The parallels could be a coincidence, but I know Kurt was active on Usenet at the time, so it's fairly likely he was familiar with this story. Perhaps this might be part of the inspiration behind the Polybius myth. There was no shortage of ideas for the avid prankster in the late 90s. Government conspiracies were en vogue due to the popularity of the X-Files. Couple this paranoia with the emergence of an exciting new digital frontier. The internet was a fertile ground for ideas to spread, a critical mass of gullibility. One hoax that gained traction around this time was the Pacific Northwest tree octopus. Proof that people will even believe stories of arbor-bound cephalopods if you tell it earnestly enough. This emerged at around the same time Kurt was working on coinop.org, and again, maybe part of the inspiration for Polybius, particularly the link to Portland. For as long as there have been internet hoaxes, there have been those who attempt to debunk them. Snopes being perhaps the most famous example. The site was born out of the alt folklore urban newsgroup, and while you won't find any trace of the Polybius myth there is some discussion given to video game related urban legends. Some of them are quite familiar. We can even see hints of proto-myths which might have helped form Polybius. One legend states that if you're able to attain a particularly impressive high score, government agents, FBI, CIA or similar, would seek you out. Why? Who knows? Recruitment, perhaps. This is strikingly similar to the plot of The Last Starfighter, in which a teenage boy is contacted by aliens in desperate need of a savior with his shoot-'em-up skills. Maybe the myth inspired the film, or vice versa. It probably doesn't matter. The link between the FBI and arcades is further strengthened by the Winners Don't Use Drugs campaign that appeared in all North American arcade games between 1989 and 2000. Quite how effective the anti-drug message was is not for me to say, but the FBI seal is imprinted on the memory of every arcade goer from that time. There's also the very real possibility that the myths were inspired by real FBI involvement in the arcades. Between bootleg machines, drugs, and illegal gambling, it's entirely plausible that the Men in Black did raid the occasional arcade, or seize the odd arcade machine. However, it's far less likely that there was a coordinated plan to control the minds of gamers in arcades, although the CIA did conduct mind control experiments with its MKUltra program. It was really more of a test of the utility of psychoactive drugs in combat and interrogation, long fodder for conspiracy nuts, but its lack of success is well documented. The government has dabbled in using video games as training aids, Atari's Battlezone for instance, and even Doom. But a full-on mind control conspiracy? That's a pretty far-out theory.
I think that the idea of the government having its act together to the point where they could put in an arcade game in a town and use it to neurolinguistically program or otherwise brainwash the populace is a pretty scary one, just due to the fact that when I was a kid, literally every politician that I could think of was terribly frightened by video games. So the thought that the government would understand technology and be able to use that against the rest of us, I think is inherently creepy, inherently cool.
Another film with shades of Polybius is The Bishop of Battle from 1983 film Nightmares. A reflection of the feared potential harm of arcades, as a hyper-addictive game gradually takes control of a boy's life as he attempts to beat the mysterious 13th level. The rapid rise in the popularity of arcades, particularly with children, caused a bit of a moral panic in the early 80s. Most concerns were relatively unfounded. The kids were there to play video games, not for drugs or gambling. But even so, the pursuit of high scores through marathon play sessions could prove deleterious. In 1981, Brian Mauro of Beaverton, Portland, suffered stomach discomfort after 28 hours of shooting for an asteroids record. It wasn't the video game that caused it, but a heady mix of sleep deprivation with a cocktail of caffeine and sugar. The odd headache and upset stomach aside, it's difficult to find evidence of any serious injury that has come from video games. However, there was an arcade-related death reported in 1982. Peter Bukowski of South Holland, Illinois, was playing Berserk when he collapsed. It was a pre-existing heart condition, possibly aggravated by stress. But for some, it was evidence that an arcade game could directly cause harm. One very real risk that video games can pose is photosensitive epilepsy. To those who are sensitive, flashing images or patterns can trigger a seizure. In the earliest days of the arcades, this wasn't commonly understood, and so some flashing effects could be pretty intense. Couple that with a darkened room, long play sessions. Despite not being particularly common, eventually someone's going to have a seizure. The first reported case of a video game triggering such a seizure was in 1981. Astro Fighter was one game implicated around this time. Today, you can see the lasting effects of these concerns. Flashing effects are rare, and in every manual for every game, you'll find the same boilerplate disclaimer.
Oh, sure. Back in the 90s, an episode of Pokemon appeared on Japanese television that caused seizures and sent 700 kids to the hospital. And that was just at 30 frames per second. Imagine what you could do with a game at 50 or 60. I bet there were some Atari games that gave susceptible kids a not-so-happy Christmas. I watched that banned footage. It made me feel weird.
The motif of harmful sensation is a recurring theme in fiction, particularly in horror. The idea that something can hurt you just by observing it. From Medusa to the Basilisk, the Ring, Polybius. A long line of legends. Sometimes they're even self-propagating, like chain letters or "you have been spooked" memes. It's a huge cliché, but somehow the notion that you shouldn't look compels us all the more. Culture is full of repeating patterns, and as Polybius took inspiration, it too has influenced others. It makes frequent cameos, seen in the background of The Simpsons, The Goldbergs, Batman Inc. The Llamasoft version is a central focus in the Less Than video by Nine Inch Nails. We love to tell stories that send shivers down spines, and with usual cynicism suspended, the internet has brought a new dimension to horror. Creepypasta is the latest face in a long line of folklore, and quite a few focus on video games. I mean, even Polybius itself fits the description. There's a whole parade of fictional games with a dark secret. The tale of a haunted Zelda cartridge told in Ben Drowned. A forbidden game from the dark web in Sad Satan. And the supposedly lost PlayStation title Petscop. It's a form of horror with mainstream appeal, hence the popularity of Minecraft's Herobrine, Slenderman, or Five Nights at Freddy's. It seems we have a hardwired attraction to mystery, a desire to cast light on our fears and on what might lurk in the shadows. Gaming is full of secrets, and in a social setting like an arcade, they can spread like wildfire. Rumours about hidden screens, secret characters, and levels abound. Most were gated behind skill demands, difficult to execute, and so nearly impossible to verify. It was easy to believe such secrets existed, and to a younger observer, witnessing an arcade technician accessing the diagnostic menus must have been mind-blowing. Hidden options behind lock and key, cryptic messages on screen, such as the special function seen within the Defender service options. It's no wonder that teen imagination ran riot with possibility. So what does that special function do? It exits the diagnostic menu and returns to the game. That's it. Invariably, when you cast a light on things, they turn out to be mundane. But the sounds and the experience of the arcades were a lot to take in. With each play costing a coin, most of us could only scratch the surface. Some games relegated to a fleeting glimpse, lost to memory. The human mind is an unreliable thing when it comes to recollection, and when we hear stories like Polybius, the mind scrambles to make connections. Somewhere, somehow. Maybe this is why some people swear they remember. Perhaps a lost memory triggered, the details hazy. But it must have been, surely. Simutric's Cube Quest from 1983 would have left quite an impression on anyone who saw it. Its hypnotic visuals and Tempest-style gameplay were unlike anything else of the era. However, it was an expensive cabinet, and probably more expensive per play to recoup costs, and Laserdisc games were notoriously unreliable. It's entirely possible such machines would disappear silently and without trace, not for conspiracy's sake, but for simple profitability. There are plenty of rarities out there that went uncatalogued for a long time. Take the East German Polyplay from 1985, for instance. Polyplay has been implicated in the Polybius myth. The name is similar, after all, and even the stylized P on the cabinet bears a similarity to Polybius's logo. Previously forgotten, one example appeared at Berlin's Computerspiel Museum around 1998, just prior to the emergence of Polybius. There were 1,000 or so units made. They were found in swimming pools, leisure centres, all over. But when the Berlin Wall fell, the machines were recalled and destroyed. Just a few remain. Perhaps a government cover-up, or maybe just an attempt to recover state-owned assets for profit. Who knows? Not every machine was as successful as Space Invaders, Pac-Man, Donkey Kong, or Galaga. There are countless games long forgotten. Obscurities, bootlegs, and prototypes of no interest to anyone but collectors. Not every game was catalogued, not every ROM dumped, and with the passage of time and the destruction of cabinets, some may even be lost. It's a worrying void of uncertainty. What if a game called Polybius did exist after all? It could be real. Like Russell's teapot, it's impossible to entirely disprove its existence, but the burden of proof lies with those telling the story. With absolutely no evidence that predates the original story, it's safe to assume that it's just a myth. But from this melange of arcade mystery, a myth like Polybius was almost inevitable. And so, as the internet came of age, that's how it began. A man inspired saw opportunity and hatched a plan. A sprinkling of detail, touch of paranoid nerve, add a mysterious screenshot, and you're ready to serve. It wasn't enough for collectors well seasoned. Most were quite cynical, and with good reason. As the tale almost stalled, a new trick was needed. A magazine tip-off ensured exposure was seeded. An explosion of interest, and any doubt drowned. Curious waves of the gullible inbound. By now, the story was simply too big to kill. Inscribed in folklore, echoed in forum posts still. An in-joke for arcade fans of spooky illusion. And for low-effort listicles, an essential inclusion. An indelible myth, but at least we know the deal. Polybius never existed, but the legend is real. Thank you very much for watching, and until next time, farewell.
Hi guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum, and today we're going to take a look at Sweden's first submachine gun. Well, actually their second submachine gun. Sweden's first submachine gun was the M37, which was a licensed copy of the Suomi M31 submachine gun with a couple of changes made to it. The sights are different, the charging handle's a little different, the barrel is shorter, and the stock profile is a bit different. Now, when this was first adopted in 1937, as I said, Sweden didn't have a military submachine gun, and so when they went looking for one, they decided that it ought to use the same cartridge as their standard service sidearm, which makes sense. Well, their sidearm at the time was the model of 1907 Colt Browning. Basically, it's a 1903 pocket automatic scaled up to the 9x20 millimeter semi-rimmed Browning long cartridge. Sweden was one of very few countries that ever actually adopted the 9x20 Browning as a military cartridge. It was a little bit of an awkward cartridge to use because it was semi-rimmed, like 32 ACP, meaning that you did have to worry about rim lock in magazines with this gun. Well, at any rate, it is what they were using in their pistols. It's what they wanted to use in the submachine gun. So the Carl Gustaf Rifle Factory designed a four-stack coffin-style magazine for this submachine gun, and it held 56 rounds because the Swedes had been issuing ammunition in 28-round boxes. Their pistols held 7 in the magazine, so that was 4 pistol magazines in a box. 2 boxes then gives you a 56-round quad-stack magazine. And in that original gun, the magazine was actually canted backwards to accommodate the semi-rimmed nature of the ammunition. So as you loaded it, it ensured that you didn't stack one rim or behind the one below it, thus causing rim lock. Anyway, the gun was not bad. They had 900 of them, which isn't a lot, but you know, in the early 1930s, who really thought you'd need a whole lot of these things? Well, by 1939, Sweden realized that they did in fact need a whole lot of these things. They didn't have enough submachine guns, they weren't in a position to manufacture more of them very quickly, and so they got a little bit panicky and started buying some guns from Germany. And what they bought were 1,500 Walther HPs, that was what would become the Walther P38 in German military service, and they bought those in 9mm Parabellum, 9mm Luger, because that's what Walther was making them in. And then they also bought 1,800 Bergmann submachine guns, both the long version and the short version, and those were also in 9mm. And as a result of that, the Swedish Army kind of inadvertently adopted 9mm. When they went to get more of the Suomi submachine guns, they decided to adapt those back to 9mm as well, that's what the Finns were making, that's what pretty much everyone was buying these things in. So they made a few alterations and adopted this version of the gun as the model of 37/39. So let's take a look at what those changes actually entailed. In 9mm now, it used the same standard quad stack coffin mag, and I think you can see here why it's called that. Used the same one as the Finnish M31 Suomis. The original 1937 guns had used a 2-position flip sight for the rear sight. That was 100 and 200 meters. When they changed it over to 9mm Parabellum, they added a 3rd leaf for 300 meters because the cartridge was more powerful and had a longer range than the 9x20. Despite 9x19 being shorter than 9x20, the 9x19 was a substantially higher pressure round and thus had a longer effective range. Now, compared to a normal Finnish Suomi, the charging handle is slightly different in contour. It has this hook to it. So that is how you would charge the gun. The selector lever down here is the same in function to a Finnish gun. All the way in is safe, and then the middle position is semi-auto, and all the way forward is full auto. These do have the same quick detach barrel design that the Finnish ones do. So you can rotate this down, rotate and remove the barrel shroud, and then remove the barrel as well. So there's the front of the receiver. The magazine catch has this nice guard behind it so that you're less likely to inadvertently dump your magazine. And then the Swedes chose a stock profile here that brings the comb up a bit higher than the Finnish gun. This is almost high enough to give you a straight line sort of recoil. I haven't shot one of these. I would be curious to have the chance to do so, and see just how it handles with a stock that's this high on the gun. That'd be interesting to try. And removing the bolt is the same as on the finish guns. I'm going to go ahead and drop the bolt. I want to pull the handle back because the handle here acts as a locking plate that prevents this from rotating. Once the handle's back, we can unscrew the rear cap. There we go. Remove the recoil spring. Pull the trigger and the bolt drops out. And that is identical in form to a standard finish Suomi bolt. You can see, however, that has that big H for Husqvarna, because it is Husqvarna that was actually manufacturing these for the Swedes. This has a fixed firing pin because it is a typical open bolt slam fire submachine gun. And there you go, one field stripped Swedish M3739 Suomi submachine gun. The Swedes probably wouldn't like me calling it a Suomi because Suomi means Finland, and they're not Finland. But they went and bought a Finnish submachine gun so they can deal with it. So these, of course, are quite scarce guns to find today. It was really cool to be able to take a look at one of these, and we can see how they differ a bit from the Finnish issue Suomi. Everyone really likes the Suomi submachine guns. They have a high rate of fire, but they have large magazines, and they're just generally a well-made and quite well-regarded gun. Hopefully you enjoyed watching the video. If you do enjoy this sort of content online, please do consider taking a look at my Patreon page. It's support from folks like you at $1 a month that makes it possible for me to travel about and find these guns and bring them to you guys. Thanks for watching.
So I finally played Titanfall 2, and after completing the campaign, what stuck with me wasn't your robot, the action, or that level. It was the title card. After witnessing the likes of Call of Duty and Battlefield throw their campaigns down a cavernous pit, this one transition felt akin to an ice-cold soda in the Sahara. This title card was the sign that Titanfall 2's campaign wasn't going to phone it in. In one shot, more creativity and style had been displayed than the majority of entire single-player components in this genre. Combining high-tech science fiction with an agile shooter, it's not a surprise that Titanfall 2's campaign sets up a power fantasy. The subcategory of fantasy isn't being a superhuman that crushes everyone beneath their foot, a la Doom. The story revolves around you being a badass in training, which is Titanfall's greatest parallel to Call of Duty 4 Modern Warfare and that game's portrayal of Soap McTavish. It's no surprise that Steve Fukuda's worked on Medal of Honor Allied Assault, Call of Duty 2, and Modern Warfare. Having been promoted from writer to director, he's retained the meticulous pacing of Infinity Ward's glory days, while combining it with the slick productions that we expect with AAA presentation, but rarely receive. Even the game's CG opening is a cut above its competition, as it establishes the importance of pilots and what separates them from your average soldier. Unlike Call of Duty Ghosts that details the adventures of a silent guerrilla unit, only to open the game with an explosion, Titanfall 2 reinforces its opening by letting you experience the difference in pilot and soldier directly. The game's script is intelligent not because of mind-bending twists or shell-shocking revelations. It's smart because it understands that dialogue and narration shouldn't be treated as gospel. BT's protocols aren't fluff, they're themes and plot points explored throughout your journey. Speaking of whom, BT is a lovable character despite being late to the party when it comes to badass robot companions, and it's because the bond between your pilot and BT is what's explored. To call him a sidekick doesn't feel right, as there are many battlegrounds you couldn't hope to survive in, and that I referred to BT as he, I think solidifies him as an equal. The option to select Cooper's dialogue isn't used as a gimmick or cheap selling point on the box, it's to connect you to BT. What surprised me about the dialogue selection is that it doesn't suffer from what Lore Runner has described as the Tor effect, where your character's tone isn't what you expected from what's shown on the screen. Because your dialogue isn't preset as mean or nice, it's simply about expressing what you believe is best in the moment, and no matter what you select, the connection developed between Cooper and BT is relatable and believable, as well as occasionally humorous.
I think somebody's in love.
A human's concept of love requires admiration, attraction, devotion, and respect. Conclusion: I am 50% in love.
Rather than shoehorn a narrative into a world, Titanfall 2's writers and directors seemingly approached it from the opposite angle, observing what narrative would complement gameplay focusing on movement, shooting, and piloting mechs. The result is a story about progressing towards a goal located far in the distance, encountering mercenaries paid to end your said progress, and developing a friendship with your Titan along the way. There's nothing about the plot that distracts or requires separation from these mechanics. It allows equal usage of free-running, shooting, and piloting, while expanding on the context and world in ways that weren't possible in the first game's multiplayer exclusivity. Having played Titanfall when it launched, I didn't put much thought into what the militia and IMC stood for, and how the latter was handled in this sequel was beautiful in its simplicity and subtlety. The game's bloodthirsty and narrow-minded villains are contracted mercenaries, and not the IMC's left and right hands, wisely avoiding the comical leaders present in other games. The IMC's apathy and artificiality isn't revealed through melodramatic speeches, but through an environment. While developing a friendship through dialogue, you're simultaneously exposed to the lengths this faction has gone to manipulate and control. And yet, after seeing the game's world through the eyes of a soldier allied with the militia, it makes me hope that in the next entry we explore the other side, something similar to Star Wars TIE Fighter or Battlefield 2 Modern Combat. Having the IMC be uncompassionate instead of comically evil only makes the story richer. And because it's wrapped around Titanfall's mechanics, the gameplay truly shines. This is one of the most effortless campaigns out there. Had I not needed to sleep, I would have completed the game in one sitting. It avoids the tired designs that grew from Modern Warfare's imitators. Gameplay variety isn't accomplished by granting you a toy built outside of the core mechanics. It utilizes the systems that Titanfall Sandbox allows and alters them accordingly. What's platforming like when the surfaces and walls aren't static? How do you deal with snipers pinning you down long corridors? What's it like to plan your wall runs and jumps ahead? It's a timeless form of game design, and Titanfall's expanded depth from Vince Zampella's previous venture means that Respawn's developers have only improved with time, and the campaign's brevity leaves no room for a level to focus on one gameplay element for too long. Just when a stage has focused on platforming for a decent amount of time, BT shows up and takes you for a ride. Come to think of it, the only issue related to pacing has to do with boss fights. On hard mode, they're a tad too easy to quickly cheese, and unfortunately, it's just the one area of Titanfall's sandbox that doesn't translate as gracefully into a single-player mode. The mech's relatively low health works in the multiplayer's lane-based design, with lots of cover, but against the AI, it's too easy to predict. Blowing up these characterized bosses is fun, it's just one of the few areas where the campaign isn't top-notch. The other is the enemy AI. Titanfall's animations are some of the best I've seen, mainly because the soldiers against you express their desperation and withheld fear so convincingly. But in terms of intelligence, they fall somewhere between A New Hope stormtroopers and a drunken quadruped. And for what I can only assume is due to abilities being attached to specific characters, Jack Cooper's adventure only allows the usage of cloaking. But when BT is able to change loadouts on the fly, unlike in the multiplayer, this decision may have been simply to streamline development. It's only unfortunate because abilities are something that Titanfall 2 has greatly expanded upon from its predecessor, and being able to use the grappling hook or stim pack in the campaign could have allowed some more player expression. But ultimately, the bosses receive enough characterization to make their inclusion a net positive, enemies have enough variety to never boil down to stand, center screen, push button, and the lack of abilities isn't a deal breaker as the campaign entertains for its duration, which is why I'm going to warn you. Disclaimer: this brief section is going to heavily spoil Titanfall 2's campaign. As it's a great game that I thoroughly recommend, if you have not played it, I urge you to pause and click here or in the video description to skip to the next part of the video. Final warning in 3, 2, 1. Titanfall 2's campaign is proof positive that just because your plot may be predictable, it doesn't mean you can't have any surprises, which is why Mission 5, Effect and Cause, has gotten so much buzz, incorporating time travel into gameplay that most have never seen in a mainstream title before. What begins as an atmospheric jog through the abandoned becomes one of Titanfall's highlights. But what stands out the most is that despite having a concept most would boast about until their lungs died, Titanfall 2 maintains its subtlety and restraint. Respawn leads the player through a miniature arc within the level's opening, at first introducing time shifts that many assume are flashbacks, to having a character in the world react to their presence, to receiving Anderson's device and affecting the world. And from there, another mini-arc begins through gameplay, where you use the device in both shooting, platforming, and Titan sequences. It is brilliant, and time traveling doesn't overstay thanks to the campaign's brevity, leaving a lasting impact. This level poignantly exposes how Titanfall improved on Call of Duty's formula. I compare this time travel level to the AC-130 gunship mission, because they're both standouts in their respective games due to their dramatic shift in context. But whereas the AC-130 has little connection with Modern Warfare's gameplay, time travel in Titanfall adds directly to its inputs. Everything about Titanfall 2's depth is preserved, only with a dramatic twist. While Titanfall's presentation, from its voice acting and music to its transitions, is excellent, how its story attaches directly to its gameplay is what makes it special. While I may not have shed a tear at the loss of BT having called his death from Scene 1, the anger I felt as I watched Sloan destroy him is a testament to the writing. Despite predicting what was going to happen, I was always eager to see how it was going to happen. Titanfall 2's multiplayer is an excellent example of how little changes in a short period can make a big difference. I participated in the game's multiplayer tech test, and while not let down, I deemed it as Titanfall 1.5 with worse maps and forgot about it. But after having played the finished product, Respawn must be commended for truly responding to important fan feedback. The industry has made many gamers doubt the importance of tests and betas, as most are used as little more than a demo or to boatload the servers without an uproar. The difference in how Titanfall 2 feels compared to its earlier builds is night and day. The sequel's map design that when explored with decreased movement speed felt empty and restrictive, now exhilarate and thrill with fast kinetic action. Going back to the original Titanfall now feels like putting on 40 pounds overnight, without the slide, enhanced stim pack, and grappling hook. That is to say that Titanfall 2's gameplay is a cut above excellence. Whereas more measured experiences such as Rainbow Six dishes out blood-pumping adrenaline in minute bursts within terrifying stretches of quiet time, Titanfall 2's perpetual battles always reward you with a rush of satisfying action. Everything from wall running to stomping soldiers to ripping an enemy pilot out of their mech is impossible to remain stoic about. The few inputs it takes to feel badass, even in a losing match, is what makes Titanfall unique. That's not to say it's an easy game, far from it. Matches will sometimes leave you utterly destroyed by enemies that understand the importance of exterminating NPCs and attrition, when to call in a Titan during bounty hunt, and how to defend an amped hardpoint. What seemed to turn my losing streaks into wins was not my precision in firefights nor the use of my equipment, but when to call in the Titan. The maps and loadout system in Respawn's debut led to Battlegrounds being a cohesive whole whether you were a Titan or a pilot, whereas the sequel has made a noticeable shift. Corridors have more cover, and sightlines for pilots are often inconvenient for Titans to focus fire on. It leads to multiplayer that has two separate games within a match, rather than a single massive battle. Playing Titanfall again made me realize why this decision was made, in theory. My mech usage was sparse, and deaths often weren't caused by enemy Titans, but by coordinated pilots that are much more difficult for your hulking monolith to keep track of, with their abundance of secluded pathways and high-damage anti-Titan weapons. Titanfall's balance set up the mechs as heavily armored machines that could be destroyed with coordinated attacks in a short span of time. The sequel removed regenerating shields from Titans, while making pilots have less opportunities to attack en masse. Death to Titans as pilots is no longer an assembled bomb, but 1,000 cuts. Forcing pilots to actively expose themselves to an enemy Titan leads to players having greatly increased time piloting what's advertised on the box. But contributing to a Titan's destruction without being detected was very satisfying in the first game, and is far less effective in its follow-up. This means that there's plenty of situations during an attrition or bounty hunt match where one team can't possibly make a comeback due to Titan dominance, removing agency in matches. I don't hold anything against Respawn for not being able to strike this balance at 100%, and it's not to say that Titanfall 2's design doesn't lead to interesting battles. Once I learned to strategize my Titan drops, I've greatly enjoyed the metagame that comes from the system, and it's enjoyable to coordinate while playing with friends. The Titan's lack of shields does mean that no shot is inconsequential, but long-term victory is never going to be as satisfying as an immediate impact. This change has also led to the rodeo being altered. Landing on an enemy Titan previously granted you the chance to rip open its metal and lay waste to the mech's core. Now it leads to a preset animation of your character ripping out the enemy's battery, and lacking control for multiple seconds in a game that's tightly controlled as this is going to be unavoidably clunky. Perhaps needing to hold on to a trigger while the animation plays out could grant the illusion of control, instead of leaving you to sit back and watch, but that's something to be explored in the future. There's really not much about Titanfall 2 that's actively worse. Different is more applicable, and nearly everything else is a substantial improvement. Progression is excellent with important weapons and gadgets not feeling unobtainable, and plenty of unlocks to chase after, wrapped around core gameplay that's enjoyable for the amount of hours required for some of these rewards. The expansions to Titanfall's sandbox are very welcome and don't conflict with what came before, abilities being the most important, striking the perfect balance of adding a layer on top of its gameplay without intruding upon firefights. One-on-one encounters are a blast, as despite the low amount of health due to the speed and abilities on offer, reversals are always possible. Having finally played Titanfall 2, I understand why those who've played it expose it to everyone they know. It's a title that is deserving of the users and recognition of its competition. Within 2 games, it's reached a seal of quality that is either equal or greater than franchises that have been around for over a decade. Electronic Arts has stated that Titanfall is a franchise they will continue to work with Respawn on for many, many years to come. For the sake of its creators and followers, I hope they're speaking the truth. Special thanks to Tiernan McCarthy, Matthew Bingley, Reality Escape, Michael Stewart, Aiku Patrupai, and Eddie Toko for supporting the channel and making this video possible. Sci-fi is one of the most heavily discussed genres in all of fiction. Its subjects in depth are endless, delving into the possible future of our species and what it even means to be human. However, futuristic role-playing video games had been something of a rarity. Starflight, Mega Traveler, and Planet's Edge ignited the concept. System Shock invented the action RPG hybrid, and the cyberpunk subgenre thrived with Syndicate, Shadowrun, and Deus Ex. But after completing what's frequently praised as the greatest Star Wars game of them all, Canada's gaming golden child wanted to bring science fiction from a universe you shoot to one you affect. The early 2000s were a time of migration. Whereas the Japanese dominated the role-playing genre on consoles for a decade, things began to shift after the 6th generation of gaming systems. Western role-playing studios had effectively secured the personal computer during Japan's monopoly on Nintendo and Sony platforms. Deus Ex, Diablo, Baldur's Gate, Fallout, and The Elder Scrolls were experiences that couldn't be offered anywhere else. But with little interest in the market of the established PC audience, RPGs were considered to be an exclusively Japanese specialty. That's when Microsoft released two of its heaviest hitters back-to-back, The Elder Scrolls III Morrowind in 2002, and Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic in 2003. The latter had been a breakout smash for Microsoft's console, BioWare's reputation, and the Star Wars brand, which had faced much criticism only a year prior. It was a celebration and brought notoriety to its relatively recent project director and lead writer, Casey Hudson and Drew Karpyshyn. Having created an experience taking place in the most recognizable space opera, BioWare's ambition only grew. Having worked closely with Microsoft and aware of the company's next-generation platform, they decided to create their own universe. Codename SFX, what ultimately became Mass Effect began production shortly after Knights of the Old Republic was released on the personal computer in 2004. The broadness behind science fiction meant that the development's earliest days focused heavily on the universe itself. Is it far or near future? Does it have aliens? Is there teleportation? What's the core scientific concept that ties everything together? And the answers for these questions only left hundreds more in their place. What's transportation like in the future? What clothes do people wear? Is the galaxy peaceful or violent? What should the musical style be? How alien are the aliens? Are they friend or foe? What's impressive about Mass Effect's development is how effectively its creativity observed what came before, being able to analyze everything from Isaac Asimov to Ridley Scott, 2001 to Star Trek, neo-noir to space opera, and used its inspiration to combine or create ideas. Mass Effect's universe was neither engulfed in war nor settled in peace. The future was far, but not enough to forget the past. Aliens were exotic and relatable. But what Mass Effect took the most from was BioWare itself. Parallels between it and Knights of the Old Republic can be seen in almost every facet, from commanding your own ship to piecing together a mysterious plot and being a Microsoft exclusive. Jade Empire also served as inspiration with BioWare's first attempt at real-time combat and alterations to its morality system, balancing compassion with ruthlessness instead of good versus evil, and recruiting that game's composer, Jack Wall. Establishing a universe that you explored and affected, and would continue to see in sequels, is something that devoured other studios. It's for this reason that the project changed over time, not to expand, but to narrow, and focus on what was vital to the experience. Mass Effect's earliest demo in 2006 showcased a game that would be the logical evolution for the studio, blending aspects of Knights of the Old Republic and Jade Empire, while combining it with new techniques, highlights being the dialogue wheel and real-time ranged combat. But while the dialogue appeared to deliver on its promise of a more seamless experience than previous BioWare games, combat appeared decidedly last generation, with a more cumbersome interface for moving squad mates to locations and auto-lock targeting. Set to release in early 2007, after the launch of action games such as Gears of War or Rainbow Six Vegas, these mechanics would have been archaic for a next-gen role-playing game. Delayed to fall 2007, BioWare spent the time altering the game's combat system to reflect a heavier focus on direct input and cutting expendable content. Farum was originally another planet named Calliston, a mining world plagued by crime and its lack of law, supporting its own hub world similar to Pharos and Novaria. Casey Hudson was quoted in August of 2007 saying that a great majority of the development was spent working on new technology. With a new dialogue and combat system being made while working on a new engine, it's understandable when some of BioWare's developers have called Mass Effect's development the land of compromise. Having begun the project with ideas of incorporating fast-paced combat, online multiplayer, and in-depth role-playing, the end product was one that focused on the universe. Mass Effect's core gameplay can be broken down into three categories that are repeated throughout: combat, conversation, and exploration. Which of these is used the most depends on the player's decisions of whether they're focusing entirely on the main plot, completing side missions, and/or talking to everyone they meet. For a majority, it'd likely fall into combat, as Mass Effect gained the attention of a new audience from their past games due to its resemblance to third-person action games. But the similarities are superficial, and while the game technically features a third-person camera, sprint, and cover system, none of them are refined enough to be acceptable in an action game of 2007. But for an RPG, it was a big leap from its precursors that were more based on digitally replicating the strategy and dice rolls of Dungeons & Dragons. Jade Empire attempted real-time combat, but to far less success and praise. Many of Mass Effect's issues in combat were technical, such as only having one button for hotkeying and a consistently dodgy frame rate, which hasn't carried on to later versions of the game. The benefit of the real-time system is the satisfaction of each kill. In KOTOR, due to always needing to be a few steps ahead of the situation and watching your character kick ass as opposed to being directly responsible, it was hard to feel the intensity of battles from the gameplay itself. Mostly, it was achieved through context. But in Mass Effect, shotgunning a criminal or sniping a Geth is satisfying right off the bat, removing much of the brutal tedium in early stages that became something of a staple in RPGs. Mass Effect's combat is engaging because it retains the growth an RPG is supposed to deliver. Being able to purchase a Master Spectre Gear shotgun maxed out with frictionless materials and cryo rounds is only a greater joy, knowing what it's like to start out with the basics. What prevents it from being great is the lack of refinement in many key areas, all of which are only highlighted in the game's early stages and when you increase the difficulty. The RPG elements in real-time action often butt heads. Forgiving that a war hero could be this inaccurate, it's often seen when placed in close call situations. There's a delay in making your character heal, use biotics, or shoot from cover that's caused by long animations. You'll learn quickly that it's best to crouch behind cover and manually peek advantage the enemy to death than to use the cover system and be stuck for a full second using biotics while the enemy commits genocide to your face. How your character automatically snaps to cover only makes the issue worse, and in the game's more cramped environments can lead to your death. It's most infuriating when against biotic enemies who knock you down at a whim, often forcing you to sit and watch your character bite the dust, unable to even pause and get your surroundings. It's these situations that make you wish Mass Effect had kept one element from its earlier builds, and that's being able to take direct control of your squad mates. Whether it was scrapped due to bugs or for design reasons, as the game is about you playing as Commander Shepard instead of creating an avatar, it's simply not satisfying to lose a fight because of an ability that renders your input moot, or because an animation exposed you to the enemy. It creates this awkward dichotomy where the game's combat is real time, but like BioWare's previous games, you need to be thinking multiple steps ahead of the enemy. The game's enjoyment peaks when you've upgraded your party with multiple abilities and modifications, allowing you to really test your strategic capabilities. But it's an eye roll when you see from the same distance that no matter what you do next, you've already lost. These issues may be forgivable if the restrictive animations were at least detailed, but they're often not. It's awkward every time Shepard snaps to cover, and even more so when his upper body is sticking above a chest-high wall. While you need to be thinking ahead of the enemy, it's certainly not because they're smart. Mass Effect's AI frequently exhibits the intelligence of an infant. Charging in the open, ignoring cover, or jumping into your crosshair. It is laughable, and the challenge certainly comes from their numbers and equipment rather than their actions. It can also come from which enemies don't register certain attacks. Even though Shepard can lift a juggernaut with the flick of a wrist, a combat drone is simply able to shrug off anything to do with affecting mass. And then there's the general lack of detail in combat, the most apparent of which being the user interface. Game Design Reviews already wrote a 3-part article detailing every fault, and while it'd take too long to break each one down here, it's possible to highlight which stood out during my latest playthrough before reading it. Mass Effect has a shield system similar to the Halo series, but its visual effects are so dim that in most combat situations you won't even notice when your shields have gone down. This is combined with sound effects so muted and low in frequency that they barely register. Instead of focusing on your aim in battle, your eyes are locked to this corner of the screen. Even this minute aspect of the game is inherently flawed. It doesn't communicate your party's growth, as the health bar is a percentage. It's presented in italics, making it harder to judge how much health you have. And it makes it appear that Shepard has more, even though you don't. The sound design is made to work in tandem with the interface, but it only adds a further annoyance, that being repetitive combat dialogue. Thanks to the lack of effective sound in the awful interface, your way of tracking Shepard's shields is his line. Lost shield! That he says every single time it happens. And perhaps this would be a petty issue had the same not occur with your enemies. Combat in Mass Effect ultimately satisfies, but the amount of minor flaws surrounding it pile up to negatively impact it significantly. From the HUD to the repetitive lines, bad AI, sticky cover system, inconsistent damage, floaty sprint movement, long animations, input delay, and the lack of autosaves forcing you to hit F5 every room like you're playing Stalker, there's simply too many for the combat itself to truly shine. Mass Effect's most influential mechanic was the dialogue wheel. Back in time, Western role-playing games were beloved, but also a tough sell on the mainstream. Microsoft helped spread them on the Xbox, but many were critical of the amount of text and reading in RPGs when compared to other titles selling by the boatload. Mass Effect attempted to retain the choice and control of conversation, while avoiding the silent protagonist and freezing time from other games. Rather than taking up vital space on the screen for multiple options where you see word for word what you're going to say, you typically have 3 lines to choose from that are paraphrases of what the player character, Commander Shepard, is going to say. At the time, the system was brand new and appeared to deliver its promise of real-time conversation to the genre. Years of retrospect, imitation, and innovation later highlight where BioWare's new system improves and regresses. The improvements are that the game is technically fully voiced along with facial expressions and inflection. The visuals are always clean and consistent, and conversations typically run at a more realistic pace as you spend less time reading options. However, the conversations are still prone to many awkward pauses, both with other characters.
If Saren finds the conduit, we're all screwed. We have to go to Ilos.
Ambassador Udina, I get the sense Commander Shepard isn't willing to let this go.
And when you're selecting an option.
Goodbye, Ambassador.
Yes, yes. Good day, Earth Clan.
While the game is fully voiced, whatever audio technique is used doesn't allow multiple people to speak at once, making more crowded sequences feel unrealistic, and it's an issue that exists today in BioWare's Dragon Age Inquisition. There's also the question of immersion. In KOTOR, while conversations paused, the immersion came from your mind filling in the blanks. You read what you say, and when you select it, the other character instantly replies.
My restraining bolt will be deactivated when you take possession of me. Am I to accompany you now? Shall I kill something for you?
Kill something for me?
Answer. Indeed. I am most eager to engage in some unadulterated violence.
The system does have an element of realism and immersion this way. Mass Effect's realism comes from its visual consistency and the fidelity in audio that allow the player character to express themselves. When it's working, it is a conventionally more effective system as you don't need to spend time getting yourself immersed before fully engaging. However, the dialogue wheel falters when it collides with its unique set of challenges. The greatest one of all, that's especially apparent in the wheel's imitators, are what Lorerunner has described as the Tor effect. It's when your paraphrase on screen results in dialogue that wasn't what you intended.
That does not look like any plan I've ever seen. This may be problematic.
Lines like those bring up another thing. The text is often all the scene needs, but because the game relies on paraphrases in the wheel, the actual line is often far more cumbersome. There's also occasions when Shepard's actual dialogue are almost the same as a paraphrase that's linked to a separate line of dialogue.
We'll find some way to help you.
The consistency of this may have been acceptable if the game never featured a direct line in the dialogue wheel, but on a handful of occasions it does.
So you'll arrest him?
The implementation is rather contrived at points. Using paraphrases in the wheel for lines of dialogue that can't fit onto the wheel makes sense, and it's relatable, as I agree with Hudson when he says that in the real world, you often phrase things differently than how you originally planned it in your head. But it doesn't make sense for lines of dialogue that consist of 5 words or less. It's unnecessary to paraphrase when Shepard's line is as simple as,
I'm listening.
Despite this annoyance, for a first attempt, the system holds up surprisingly well, mainly because the writing has enough clarity, something that even games of today haven't fully realized. What's been imitated less over the years is the Paragon Renegade system. Star Wars followed a light dark side system that allowed players to be Skywalker, or, well, Skywalker, and it was inserted very well within the Star Wars universe. Being its own, and with Shepard as the first human Spectre, a league of agents not bound by galactic law, it makes sense that Paragon and Renegade are the 2 logical approaches to being an agent. Paragon is compassionate, and Renegade is ruthless. When engaging in conversation, you'll potentially earn Paragon or Renegade points depending on your choices. As you gain points in both categories, you're able to invest skill points into either Charm or Intimidate, allowing further conversation choices in either category. It's great that the system doesn't restrict you to going fully Paragon or Renegade, but by the same token, what the game considers compassionate or ruthless is often questionable. It puts into perspective why games of today are steadily moving away from binary morale systems, as when you're tackling morally gray subjects, it's easy to disagree with the author on what's right or wrong. And while you earn points in both Paragon and Renegade separately and level up each option, you'll still run into choices that are grayed out, and if the goal of the dialogue wheel is to aim for realism, then this inclusion is flat out nonsense. It's also inconsistent on what Renegade and Paragon repeatedly stand for. The ruthlessness of a Renegade is often attached to pro-humanity patriotism, whereas Paragon typically leans towards unification between aliens, and it never really adds up. Sacrificing thousands of human lives to save the Council can easily be viewed as ruthless, yet the game labels it as a strictly good option that must be attributed to a Paragon. As with dialogue, the Paragon and Renegade system are mostly accurate in their portrayals and actions. It's just that the errors made along the way could have been avoided with some relatively minor alterations. To complete Mass Effect's gameplay triangle is exploration with the Mako, a vehicle that's the result of a one-night stand between a BTR and a Lamborghini. It's featured on each planet you visit in the main quest, but its main usage is during side missions. Uncharted worlds always begin with the Mako landing on the planet, where you're free to explore. Vehicle sections in previous BioWare games never felt a part of the game itself. KOTOR projected the future of mobile drag racing games, and Jet Empire ripped off Galaga. Through this lens, the Mako is a gargantuan leap from what the developers previously made. While I joke about its design, marrying a BTR and a supercar isn't an insult. The Mako is a badass looking vehicle and is immediately recognizable in its appearance. But that's not what it's remembered for. While early trailers show the vehicle behaving realistically, in the final product, the Mako has a bizarre handling and physics model. Its tires have traction that defies comprehension, but the hull is seemingly made out of styrofoam. Yahtzee's description of it behaving like a fat man on a unicycle is more fact than analogy. It's not helped by how the Uncharted worlds are designed, which will be covered. And the Mako's main cannon can barely alter its angle. While the game's enemies built for the Mako sections are based around dodging projectiles, due to how you can't aim up or down at close range, it often leads to players just sniping people from across a level, which you can do since the vehicle's optics have a further range than your actual sniper rifle. It's very much a missed opportunity since this game was released during a period when other science fiction shooters mainly used bulky Abrams-style tanks. It would have been refreshing to have a futuristic APC with the ability to use jump jets. But its inconsistent handling and baffling physics model leave much to be desired, and of the three core gameplay pillars, it's easily the weakest. There's certainly fun to be had liquefying your enemies with an explosive cannon, but it's not nearly as engaging as the idea on paper. The most effective way to use the vehicle is the most boring way, sniping enemies from a mile across or ignoring their existence. What Mass Effect intended was to have the role-playing genre include those with a violent distaste for dice rolls and non-direct input. Me, in other words. It's an ultimate success, and Mass Effect does effectively balance between role-playing and action. You feel the growth of Shepard as you progress, leveling up your skills, weapons, mods, and companions. It's satisfying to shotgun every Geth with a single blast, lift a giant with your mind, or throw an Asari off a cliff. But with time, the combat just doesn't hit as hard as it should. Biotics don't have a sense of weight. Whether the enemy is a scruffy merc or Krogan warlord, they're knocked over like plastic. This issue also extends to the Mako, and while its bouncy castle physics are responsible for making it behave like a toy, it's also the lack of sound. Biotics usually have a delay, and enemies look like they fall over instead of being thrown. Lift is too slow, and all you hear is a gentle whoosh. As much as I enjoy the assault rifles upgraded with frictionless materials, I think the reason I typically select shotguns is simply that they're one of the few weapons in the game that have a real punch to them. The metaphoric rough edges aren't just in combat, it's something the game as a whole can't escape. From its constant pop-in textures to micromanaging your crew and all your loot, and the terrible heads-up display that doesn't allow you to view your journal in the galaxy map. At every turn, the game's interactivity has a speed bump that prevents you from going full throttle. Overall, though, it ultimately engages, and thanks to many elements that have been unfortunately removed since. But BioWare wasn't noted at the time for their combat mechanics or polish. They were known for their story, characters, and quests. Mass Effect's tale is one that's taken influence from Knights of the Old Republic, as it was led by the same director and writer, but it's told and presented in a much different fashion. Netsteel Republic had you creating an avatar who begins with amnesia, allowing you to pave the way for your creation's adventure. Its twist was that it connected that avatar to an established character in the story. In Mass Effect, there's no great twist related to your hero, and he or she isn't an avatar. Commander Shepard begins as an established character who's grown up and fought in this universe for many years of their life. You're able to adjust Shepard's backstory with 3 different upbringings and life-changing events, but ultimately, you're stepping into someone else's shoes instead of making your own, as had been the case in BioWare's RPGs for years. As Shepard is a member of the Systems Alliance, humanity's military, it allows him or her to be inexperienced enough for the player to discover much of the Mass Effect universe along with the player character. And even when the player isn't in sync with the protagonist, it can be done to establish the universe further. When our own character says they don't normally send Spectres on shakedown runs, we know even without knowledge of the specifics that Spectres are important. The narrative is one of mystery and discovery, things that are easy to take for granted as a fan, forgetting what it was like to witness the Rachni, Thorian, and Sovereign for the first time. But it's safe to say that the plot is far more interesting in its later half than the beginning. Mass Effect's opening doesn't do the greatest job of selling the experience. While it establishes everything effectively, it has a large number of cliches without any twists or alterations. From the gung-ho rookie who's immediately killed to the villain who prances around like a teenager without Wi-Fi. The storytelling is far more visual than previous BioWare games that heavily relied on their writing to gain the viewer's attention. It's a far more seamless experience than KOTOR's plethora of letterbox dialogue and CG cutscenes. But the cinematography is let down when already cliché sequences demonstrate equally contrived visuals, such as when Saren's interior ship pulses red light to communicate his rage. Just as with the story, things seem to improve later on with some truly vivid imagery. The beginning is also the weakest aspect of the game due to its rushed pacing on the Citadel and cobbling together of Therum. You grab 3 companions and become the first human Spectre within an hour, and Therum reused Calston's assets to make for a series of events that's rather artificial. Needing to rescue Liara from a force field that traps its own user, forcing Shepard to fire a mining laser to create an entrance that begins the collapse of the underground tunnel Shepard and company are in, is far less appealing than uncovering corporate secrets and alien creatures on Noveria and Pharos. It's not a terrible mission, but certainly the most forgettable of the main quest, and isn't able to hide its unfortunate development when simply compared to other planets. Time spent on the Citadel in Act 1 isn't lacking due to the characters or story, but rather the pacing and convenience. From the 2 mercs sent to eliminate you to tip off the desperation of our antagonists, to having 3 separate characters all have a recent connection to Saren or the local mobster Fist. But the building blocks in Act 1 are also responsible for why the game improves with time. All of the characters have a believable connection to the story. Garrus Vicarian's outrage of Saren's untouchable status, Rex's will to accomplish something more than a paycheck, Tali'Zorah's pilgrimage set to prove herself fighting for the greater good, and Liara T'Soni's coming of age in defense against her corrupted mother. Commander Shepard's another example. He or she isn't a brick in Mass Effect's debut. Shepard grows as a character, beginning as a respected Alliance officer and ending as a galaxy-saving Spectre. Shepard isn't nearly as layered as the companions, but there's enough to make this player character feel established and relatable. Hanging up on the Council after every briefing has become one of the series' in-jokes, but it reinforces humanity's place in the galaxy, that they aren't the dominant species as in many science fiction stories. Even Saren improves significantly after encountering him on Vermeer, when realizing that he's not bringing back ancient machines to wipe out the galaxy out of hatred for humanity, but to hopefully spare galactic life as obedient slaves rather than losing to outright genocide. While Mass Effect pushes its visuals artistically and technically beyond what BioWare had previously done, it's ultimately the writing that carries the story. Not because of its attention to detail, as there are many budgetary or engine limitations that form some inconsistencies, but because of its characters and the universe they're involved in. The personalities you encounter on and off ship are what's been attributed to Mass Effect 1's success, and it's a winning hypothesis. Without Shepard's rise in status, your squad mates' charisma and backstories, or Saren's motivations, the tale would only be a bland retelling of Knights of the Old Republic. And even the similarities to that game are altered with skill. Instead of revealing your character as the greater evil, the revelation falls onto the Reapers. It's unnerving to this day when you hear Sovereign, realizing that what previously seemed to be a giant ship was an intelligent life form who far exceeds the capabilities of organic and synthetic life. and that the life form is now talking down to you. Sovereign's reveal is arguably the highlight of Mass Effect's story, and it's an event that, without its proper characterization, wouldn't have succeeded. Mass Effect's main quest achieves a large-scale space opera that enlightens everyone on what this universe is about, but it comes at the cost of emotional weight and branching paths. Each gaming generation has raised fidelity while sacrificing the amount of content that's possible. Greater tools on a narrowing canvas. Less is often more, but some things have been left behind in the transition from Knights of the Old Republic to Mass Effect. In KOTOR, the plot remained relatively similar up until the very end, when light or dark side resulted in very different conclusions. Mass Effect's ending only has minor alterations, most of which have to do with the body count, and the game's attempts at tugging your heartstrings don't make their mark in the main quest. The most obvious moment is when Shepard needs to decide between sacrificing Ashley or Kaidan. But voice files reveal that the option of saving them both was originally available. It's understandable that without this moment of sacrifice, there isn't much to raise the stakes after Virmire, but this alteration to the story leads to other questions, such as how Kaidan can be left behind but the STG team can make it back to the Normandy. And there's Saren's final encounter before being controlled by Sovereign. While the character's motivation is interesting and layered, Saren's ultimately let down by his demise, as you're able to convince him to do the noble act and make him commit suicide with only a few dialogue options.
There's still one way to stop this, if you've got the guts.
Goodbye, Shepard. Thank you.
The Reapers can't be stopped. Yes, they can. We can't stop them. Yes, we can. Okay. It's this sequence that highlights the dialogue wheel's greatest fault. In real conversation, you're always having to say one thing at the expense of another. The topic may allow you to revisit something you wanted to say before, but the flow of conversation is a two-way street of communication, a cocktail of directing and responding. But in Mass Effect, and consequently many RPGs of today, dialogue is simply about extracting as much information from people as possible. There's no consequence to repeatedly nagging a character about every little detail you need out of them. Dialogue is about exhausting every single option on the screen until there's nothing left, rather than navigating a true conversation with an intelligent being. And it comes to a head in situations such as Saren's encounter, where the player knows subconsciously or not that selecting Renegade or Paragon will resolve the situation. There's little tension in a scene that's supposed to leave the player on edge. It's a moment where the excellent writing isn't able to prevent the narrative being damaged by this fault in design. Artistically, Mass Effect is a title that's varied and beautiful, and within a single game, the Normandy, Citadel, Relays, Krogans, Turians, Quarians, and so much more became iconic to the universe BioWare created. But in being the first of the series, it is the most visually and sonically muted. There's many elements that are rather defective, visuals and assets that could be ripped straight into any large number of science fiction settings, without much identity to make them stand out on their own. Being that the team began from scratch, it's understandable that many of the minor details such as scenery, armors, and textures aren't going to be fully realized. The scale of the universe required the artist to realize a vast amount of content from aliens to worlds. And the work done is very impressive, but when it comes to finer details, it does occasionally bore, and no amount of texture mods can change that. And technical issues hurt the art's presentation. It's always more difficult to immerse yourself in the space created when it's always loading right in front of you. In starting from scratch visually and technically, BioWare weren't able to set their vision in perfect focus, and this is compounded by the music. Jack Wall was originally too busy to work on the project, but he recommended Sam Hewlett to BioWare, and the developers hired him to start the demo process. In the early stages, Mass Effect was attached to synthesizers and 80s influences such as Tangerine Dreams or the score for Blade Runner. Sam's expertise in this field meant that before Jack Wall came back, some pieces were already beginning to stick.
Today, it's still my favorite piece of all the pieces in Mass Effect. It blows every other one away to me, because you hear it, and you're in the Mass Effect universe immediately, and there's nothing like it.
When Jack Wall came on to Mass Effect as its composer, it only took 6 months for Sam Hewlett to come back and work together, combining Jack's orchestral talent with Sam's knowledge of electronics. Just as with the art, many of the tracks in Mass Effect are exquisite. Vigil is a piece that engulfs its atmosphere around the listener. The end delicately wraps up the story while signifying future adventures. And the battle music on Ilos or Therum complements your destruction. But for every track that impresses, there's a few more that, while endorsing the experience, don't have an emotional effect. What ultimately hurts tracks such as these is the sound design. There aren't many layers being used in the game's audio, and it's due to a restriction with the technology. During chaotic battles, audio effects are often cut short or muted entirely, and when titles such as Halo 2 were capable of running dozens of sounds on the original Xbox at once, it comes to question why Mass Effect's audio was so thin. Usage of the game's music ends up not working in tandem with audio to support it. This is especially evident in the side missions, where on many occasions the only audio played is Jack and Sam's subtle ambience and your footsteps. It makes environments feel static and dry, and it's something that extends to planets in the main quest. The music has more layers here, but it's typically on a 1-minute loop that has little variation. And the mix of audio itself is off, often making it hard to hear characters in these scenes, or abruptly increasing their volume. All of these issues stem from technical and logistical constraints. Jack Wall was handed 40 minutes worth of cinematics 2 weeks before the project was complete. Richard Jacks and David Cates were brought on to create additional music for these scenes, and while they did a good job, especially considering the time constraint, it didn't allow Mass Effect's score to be a cohesive whole. But it certainly set the stage for the future. In the end, Mass Effect's story is layered, mysterious, and fascinating, but it's not an emotional ride from beginning to end, and lacks some of the impact found in the main quest of KOTOR. As the main quest tackles corruption, loyalty, and redemption, Mass Effect's side missions are a bit more direct with their subjects. Largely, these side missions are about the system's alliance, AIs, and biotics. They exist to flesh out aspects of the Mass Effect universe that at first glance appear to be simplistic. For those that only follow the main quest, it's easy to view the Geth as classic cannon fodder evil, and the system's alliance as a noble military always taking charge when needed. These side missions don't so much reveal, but rather hint towards possibilities that range from alluring to horrific. The largest side quests are the Uncharted worlds, but there's plenty more on the Citadel, and some can be found on planets you visit along the main quest, with exception to Therum and Ilos. For variety, not all of these side missions are related to those 3 subjects, allowing Shepard to assist in a C-Sec case at Cora's Den, or shooing a persistent Hanar. There are an overabundance of these short stories. Even in my devoted playthrough for this video, I missed out on dealing with a questionably pro-human political party, to reuniting with Shepard's former gang, and taking charge in negotiations on a resource-rich planet. The amount of things to do on offer is impressive to this day. 3 of these quests also pertain to your crew members. Garrus, Tali, and Rex have minor storylines that you can complete, and while they don't expand the universe as much as the Uncharted worlds, they further flesh out the great cast you've brought on board. A surprisingly large number of these side missions, even those that suffer from significant problems, potentially end with a thought-provoking finale, the most common of which having to do with artificial intelligence. On Earth's moon, a virtual intelligence has gone rogue, even though that's not meant to be possible. Fighting your way through its infuriating waves of combat drones, it ends with a string of numbers. Unnerving at first, the game cleverly unlocks a specialization class for Shepard in this mission. It's likely to make the player forget about the numbers, but after researching further, you find out that this is binary, spelling help. The idea of a preset program crying out as you destroy it leaves the story with a boatload of questions, only a handful of which can and would be answered in future games. Another example is the end of the Geth incursions. After going from planet to planet destroying any Geth base you come across, the death of your final enemy ends with a description of a tragic Quarian song being transmitted to the Geth, even those who remain in their creator's world. The Geth would be examined further in Mass Effect 2, but side quests such as these allow us to ponder at the depth of these intelligent beings. That transmitting a song mourning the worlds and innocence of Quarians lost during the conflict against what they created doesn't add up if these machines are emotionless software. Unfortunately, the Geth incursions are an easy example of where the side missions stumble. The astronomical lack of resources and probable lack of time, if Casey Hudson's interview is accurate, means that these side missions rely almost entirely on their context, as well as literal text. Mass Effect's main quest is presented with cinematics and dialogue, but the side missions often take a time jump to the past, needing the player to use paragraphs of text on screen as a plate for their brain to fill. The writing is often enough fuel to stimulate the mind, but the 4 levels and assets repeated over and over and over and over is likely to leave users mentally starved. And these environments aren't restricted to side stories, as they consist of retooled assets from the main quest. Even the minigame ends up being another gap made to let your mind fill with projection. It's only a minor annoyance when used for hacking open locked crates and computers, but when scanning minerals, pyramids, or even a mummified corpse by steering an arrow into the center or button tapping, it quickly becomes a gag. The budget for these missions was so low, or time was so short, that mummified corpses aren't modified in the slightest to show it. And then there's the Thresher Maws, capable of instantly killing you by pure luck. Though it's easy to exploit them by using jump jets before it arises from the ground. Even when hit, you'll be knocked back by the bouncy castle physics instead of dying. The biggest issue of all in these missions is with the Mako, not the vehicle itself despite its objective faults. What's questionable is how the terrain on these uncharted worlds is laid out like the level designers rolled